This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're finally getting into an actual NHL roster player. And that's one of the big free agent signings this past summer in Oliver Ekman-Larsson. There's a lot of baggage when it comes to OEL, but he's coming off of a resurgent season with the Florida Panthers in which he won the Stanley Cup, of course. He comes to the Maple Leafs on a 4-year contract at $3.5 million per season. A lot of mixed feelings about that contract, to say the least, and so we're going to dive into OEL's game, what worked last season with the Panthers, and how he could potentially impact the Leafs roster this season, and of course over the remaining term of the contract as well. For starters, I think it's important to kind of reset expectations for Ekman-Larsson. I think a lot of people get kind of an opinion on a player, and it's very hard to change that opinion on that player. Happened a while ago with Ekman-Larsson, where he was regarded as one of the most underrated defensemen in the NHL when he was with Phoenix and then Arizona, where probably should have gotten more Norris attention than he actually got in some of those 20-goal seasons that he had in Arizona in his early to mid-20s. But then his game started to dip in Arizona, but the feeling about him still being underrated was still there until he got traded to Vancouver. And by the end of his tenure in Arizona, people were starting to flip from this is under one of the underrated best defensemen in the NHL to, oh, he's falling off of a cliff and that contract he signed is going to be an anchor. So he gets traded to Vancouver in that crazy trade that involves Connor Garland, a top 10 pick that turns into Dylan Guenther, like a bunch of crazy pieces. And he only lasts 2 seasons in Vancouver, and his stock basically completely tanks. He goes from a few years prior, like I mentioned, being one of the highest regarded underrated players in the NHL because he was playing in Arizona, to being one of the biggest boat anchors on the salary cap in the entire NHL. He was making way too much against the salary cap for what he was providing the Vancouver Canucks. They were playing him 22 minutes, 20 minutes in those 2 seasons that he was there because of the contract that he was on at over $8 million. But he wasn't providing that value. And so it becomes cycle where you want the player to be in this role because of the amount of money that you're paying him, but he can't play well in that role. And so the cycle just keeps going and going and going. And that's what we call the sunk cost fallacy, ladies and gentlemen. Ultimately, the Vancouver Canucks decided to buy out Ekman-Larsson last summer in what is the biggest buyout in NHL history in terms of a regular, normal buyout, not one of the compliance buyouts that don't count against the cap, in terms of the largest value being bought out remaining on the contract. And just to give you some perspective, some people are concerned about Ekman-Larsson's term at 4 years for the Maple Leafs at 33 years old. I'm definitely one of those people concerned about that. But he will still be on the Canucks cap for another 3 seasons after his Maple Leafs contract is over. That's how long the buyout goes for Ekman-Larsson in Vancouver. But that's a whole separate issue. He gets to Florida and he plays well. But I think a lot of people still associate their perception of Ekman-Larsson's value and what he can be to a team to what his previous contract was, to what he was in Vancouver and at the end of his Arizona tenure. And that's something where we need to change that. He's not the player that he was at the end of his tenure in Vancouver and Arizona. He's also not making the bloated salary he was. So we need to realign our expectations or our thoughts on Ekman-Larsson as a player to what he has done most recently with the Panthers, and then what he will be making with the Maple Leafs this upcoming season. And that's $3.5 million. So before we get into the actual cost of things, how did he perform last season with the Panthers? And extremely well is the answer that I would give. He scored 32 points, 9 goals in 80 games, played a little over 18 minutes per game in the regular season, and in the playoffs, he saw that role diminish a little bit, going down to 15-27 per game en route to the Stanley Cup, where he put up 2 goals and 6 points in 24 games. His underlying numbers were spectacular. By Evolving Hockey's expected goals model, Oliver Ekman-Larsson was worth 10.9 expected goals above replacement. That's 1.8 expected wins above replacement. Extremely good generating things in the offensive zone. Good on the power play as well. And so overall, Ekman-Larsson's profile is extremely good based off of the analytics last season. And you compare that to the year prior, his last season with Vancouver that ended early due to an ankle injury, and Ekman-Larsson was a negative value player in the offensive zone instead of being nearly a 10 expected goals above replacement player in the offensive zone. Ultimately, he was a negative goals above replacement player in his last season with Vancouver, but in his first season with Vancouver, he was actually a positive player as well. By the expected goals above replacement model that Evolving Hockey has, he only has 2 seasons that are below replacement level. That was his last season in Arizona in 2020-21 and his last season in Vancouver in 22-23. So overall, over his entire career, Ekman-Larsson has been a positive value player and had some really big seasons as well in Arizona. Ultimately, things have faltered over the past couple of seasons, partially due to injuries, but he found his game again last season. So the main question is he worth $3.5 million? Can he sustain that over a 4-year term? And did this contract make sense for the Maple Leafs? Looking at the players that signed, or the defensemen I should say, that signed around $3.5 million in free agency, and I gotta say, at least for this upcoming season, Ekman-Larsson is probably the defenseman that I feel best about, or second best about, I'd probably say. I like Sean Walker's fit with Carolina, just given the way that they play, the defenseman that they like, the style that they like, and getting him at $3.6 million after a really solid season, I think is a good fit there for Carolina. But other than him, all the other defensemen that signed in that $3.5 million range really worry me on those contracts that they signed. Obviously, the big scary one is Joel Edmondson at $3.85 million. That is an insane contract for Los Angeles, and that's probably going to age very poorly. Matt Dumba at $3.75 million. He was not good last season with Arizona. He did not play very well with Tampa Bay either, and he gets more money than Ekman-Larsson, of course, on a shorter term though. Ilya Lyubushkin at $3.25 million. No chance in hell I was ever paying that for Ilya Lyubushkin. Solid player, not a good player if you're paying him over $3 million against your cap to play legitimate top 4 minutes. Ian Cole, another one of those guys that is a good kind of third pairing veteran player, but that's not what the Leafs were really looking for in a player like Ekman-Larsson. I think the one player that kind of stands out is Shane Gostisbehere, and it depends on what you want on the scale of offense to defense, two-way to specialized player. Ekman-Larsson is a fine defensive player at even strength. It's not his strength, to say the least, but he's at least serviceable. He's probably better than Shane Gostisbehere in that regard. I think most people would agree with that. Offensively, Ekman-Larsson is, again, good. It's probably his better side, definitely, than his defensive side. He can power play quarterback as needed. Probably not your power play 1 quarterback at this point in his career, unless you want to move things around or get a different look. Shane Gostisbehere, on the other hand, is definitely a power play 1 quarterback. Just look at the 56 points he put up last season. And so you compare those two, and Gostisbehere signs for $3.2 million. Ekman-Larsson signs for $3.5. One has a bit more veteran experience that can help some of your other defensemen develop. Also older, so you worry about the length of the term. Also has maybe a bit more short up defensive game. And so those two are probably the two that I would look at as the comparables. If the Leafs wanted to go somewhere else than Ekman-Larsson, Gostisbehere could have been an option, but I think they were looking for more of a well-rounded two-way option than kind of the Gostisbehere option, which is a lot more looking at the offensive side of things. So ultimately, the cap hit going into this season, I actually don't mind it at all for Ekman-Larsson at the $3.5 million tag based off of who was available this year. My concern is with the term, because he's 33 years old at the start of this contract. It's a 4-year term. I don't know what Ekman-Larsson is going to look like at 36, 37 years old. He's had some injury issues in recent seasons, and that's part of the reason why his game fell off so much at the end of his Arizona and into his Vancouver tenure, was he was battling a lot of lower body injuries. It was really hampering his mobility, and it was resulting in him playing too much and not being able to handle those minutes as well. If the Leafs properly manage Ekman-Larsson and use him in the role that he succeeded in Florida, I think that this could be a good contract, and Ekman-Larsson can be a good player for the Maple Leafs for at least a couple of seasons. I worry about how they're planning to use him, though. Ekman-Larsson was good in a third pairing role. He did not play a top 4 role in Florida. I want to make that abundantly clear, because I think a lot of people see the Ekman-Larsson name and they expect, oh, this guy played over 20 minutes, workhorse defenseman, plays a bunch, can eat those minutes, top 4 guy, easy. That's not really how he was used in Florida, though. Looking at his usage, he started the season high in the lineup, and that's because Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour were out until mid-November. In that 16-game stretch without those two in the lineup, he was fantastic. He played almost 24 minutes a night. He played upwards of 28 minutes a couple of times. He had 10 points in 16 games. I don't think that's sustainable for Ekman-Larsson at this point. We've seen that in recent years where he's played too much for what his body can handle at this point, and the results suffer. He moved down the lineup into that third pairing role with Dmitry Kulikov once the two aforementioned players came back to the lineup, and he played closer to 17 minutes a night, put up 22 points in 64 games the rest of the season, and was a third pairing defenseman. He jumped up higher in the lineup as needed, but was primarily a third pairing guy. And then we get to the playoffs, and as I mentioned, he only played like 15 and a half minutes in the playoffs. At the end of the Stanley Cup final, he was playing more than that. He was playing 17, 18 minutes, and I think that's partially due to the fact that, of course, he got higher on the power play, which we'll get to in my conversation coming up, but also to the fact that the Panthers managed his workload over the course of the season. He played a third pairing role. He wasn't playing over 20 minutes, which he had done for his entire career since his rookie season, which was just too much for him to handle at this point. And so we actually had gas in the tank to play 15, 16, 17 minutes a night over the course of over 100 games this season between the regular season and the postseason. So if the Leafs use him in that third pairing role, which there's a way that they could absolutely do that, I think it's a really intriguing fit. Sure, $3.5 million is maybe a hair expensive for what the Leafs would ideally want to spend on a kind of fifth defenseman on the depth chart, but it's a good fit and the player plays good, you're happy with it. I worry if the Leafs then signing him at $3.5 million and seeing that resurgent season go, okay, let's see you play 20, 22 minutes again in our top 4. That's where I start to worry. So if Ekman-Larsson plays 18-ish minutes a night, gets some power play 2 minutes, maybe even jumps on the top power play unit as needed, I think it's an intriguing player for at least these couple of seasons. I like his fit actually with Timothy Liljegren. I think there's a lot that Liljegren can learn from Ekman-Larsson. I think it's good to have somebody that is a Swede that can help Liljegren on the back end. I think it just makes things more natural in terms of communication on the ice, in terms of having a built-in mentor there for Liljegren to see his game take another step. And I think that's something that ultimately helped Gustav Forsling last season in the early going. Ekman-Larsson, when he was playing those big minutes in the early going without Montour and Ekblad in the lineup, he was doing that with Gustav Forsling, who had a massive breakout season, one of the best defensemen in the NHL now, and should be regarded as that. And one of the things that helped him in the early going last season was playing with Ekman-Larsson. So I hope that we see Liljegren with Ekman-Larsson, because it would be great to see kind of that mentorship and maybe a legitimate partnership begin to form between those two players, because Ekman-Larsson is going to be here for term. Liljegren signed to a 2-year deal. If those two can basically be like a 2B pairing or even a 2A pairing with the Simone Benoit, Jake McCabe pairing, if that ends up being what it is, I think that's a really exciting fit. I just worry if they push Ekman-Larsson higher in the lineup, if they pair him with Jake McCabe and expect those two to play 22, 23 minutes. I just don't see Ekman-Larsson really being the guy that can handle that kind of workload anymore. One of the things that really stood out, and one of the cool things that we have now, is the NHL Edge data. And it's a terrible website to use. It's basically impossible to try and find data from that website. But something that was really interesting that I came across in compiling data was Oliver Ekman-Larsson's skating data. Looking at his final season in Vancouver, he had 11.1 18-mile-an-hour bursts per 60 and a top speed of 21.4 miles per hour. Last season with the Panthers, and I should say that 11 bursts per 60 is a little bit around average, maybe a little bit below average for a defenseman. Last season with the Panthers, that skyrocketed up 4 bursts per 60 to 15.4 18-mile-per-hour bursts per 60 and a top speed almost a mile and a half faster at 22.9. So the skating was legitimately better last season for Ekman-Larsson based off of the data that we have available. He was moving better, he was playing better, and he was playing in a more managed role. He was feeling healthy after recovering from some lingering lower body issues that he'd been playing through at the end of his Arizona tenure and in Vancouver. He was healthy last season. His team managed him well. He played well, and his team won the Stanley Cup. It would be great to see Ekman-Larsson play a similar role to that because it's what he excelled in last season. As I said, I worry if he plays higher in the lineup and is forced higher in the lineup that he could struggle if he has to play that over the entire season. He can absolutely play that role in a pinch. We saw at the beginning of last season. We saw it a couple of times when the Panthers were without certain players on the back end. He can play that top 4, top pairing role in a pinch. He can't play that role over the course of an entire season anymore. Now, to dive more into Oliver Ekman-Larsson's season with the Panthers last year en route to the Stanley Cup, very excited to get to my conversation now with Colby Guy. Very excited to welcome on Florida Panthers reporter Colby Guy to talk a little bit about newest Maple Leafs defenseman Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Colby, thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on today.
So I think it's best to kind of start at the beginning of the season for Ekman-Larsson and kind of go over the course of the season. So last year, obviously, the big buyout, the biggest in NHL history in terms of a normal buyout, in terms of the value of the rest of the contract being bought out. What were the expectations for Ekman-Larsson coming into last season for the Panthers, coming in on a 1 year, $2 and a little bit million contract?
Yeah, so I mean, with Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour both injured to start the season, coming off that last Stanley Cup run where they fell short against the Golden Knights, both of them were coming off shoulder surgery. I mean, the immediate opportunity for Ekman-Larsson was to kind of bounce back from those past couple seasons he had in Vancouver when he was dealing with injuries. He's finally coming into a situation where he's fully healthy. He had a full offseason to recover. And with that, he got the opportunity to play on the top pairing with Gustav Forsling. And looking at just how they played, how they gelled together, and also the fact he manned the first power play unit, he took that opportunity and ran with it. And he still has the ability to play quality minutes. He put up some pretty good points during that stretch at the start of the year where he was holding things down for Ekblad and Montour too. So he looked close to vintage Oliver Ekman-Larsson back there, and he even looked like he gained a step defensively that he didn't have when he was with Vancouver. And I mean, playing with Gustav Forsling helps because that man's an animal on defense. But I mean, just looking at the body of work he put together, especially during that start of the season where the Panthers were one of the best defensive teams in hockey during that stretch. He was a big reason because of it. And he just was able to kind of finally have that healthy offseason, finally have a healthy training camp to learn the system in Florida, get used to it. And all of a sudden he played top pairing minutes for a solid month and a half there while Florida's top guns were getting back into the lineup, and he did a pretty damn good job.
Yeah, just how important was that early season stretch when Ekman-Larsson was on that top pairing with Forsling with, as you mentioned, two of the top defensemen out of the lineup? Because I know coming into the year outside of Florida, that was the big concern with the Panthers is early season. Are they going to be able to make it through the early part of the season without two of their top defensemen? And obviously, nobody really saw the huge season from Forsling coming. We probably should have, all things considered. But Ekman-Larsson was a big part of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the narrative going into the season, a lot of people had the Panthers missing the playoffs just
Yeah.
because the back end was so depleted, and it was not even just Montour and Ekblad being gone. It was also Radko Gudas being gone, and some other new faces kind of being shuffled in and out of that blue line. And perhaps the most impactful of all those guys they brought in was Oliver Ekman-Larsson because he was able to provide an offensive punch if they needed it. He played on the power play all throughout the year. He was on power play 2 for a good chunk of it. He got his power play time back in game 7, and they ended up scoring a power play goal right after a power play expired to open up the scoring in game 7. So even after that, after all that, he's still impactful on that power play and can be a useful piece on the power play. But he was just a very just overall calming presence in the locker room too. He's been around for quite a while and he's dealt with a lot in his life too. So that's just another guy that can come in there and add to the guys that do really well through adversity. I mean, through all the hardship the Panthers faced this season, he was one of the calming voices in that room, and a guy that Gustav Forsling was able to look up to as well during that breakout season. So, I mean, he just provided a lot to the team, and I mean, you know how it turned out. They won the Stanley Cup, and Oliver Ekman-Larsson's a Stanley Cup champion.
Yeah, and that's incredible considering the kind of narrative around him the past few seasons, and largely being down to the contract and what he had in Vancouver and previously Phoenix, Arizona before that. And one of the things in modern NHL that you can't really get away from is the value of a player being attached to that cap hit as well. And one of the things with that is you kind of get an idea of what a player is to you, and then their contract changes. But I think that that is yet to catch up with Ekman-Larsson. Do you think that's something that's still the case right now, where a lot of people still consider him this kind of overpaid, overrated defenseman, when in reality he was making $2 million last year and he's going to be making 3.5 for the next few seasons with the Maple Leafs?
Yeah, I mean, when looking at his current cap hit, he made his money, and he earned every cent of it playing the way he did for the Panthers, and obviously being a key piece of that Stanley Cup run. But I mean, the big key piece with Ekman-Larsson's struggles in Vancouver was injuries, and he was just being put out there while he was dealing with an injury that was keeping him from being at 100%. And a lot of these were lower body injuries, so the fast skating, the back checking, all of that that comes with it, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, that was kind of being shut down when he was in Vancouver. And there were moments where you were thinking that, but in reality, the guy's just dealing with injuries, and he never really had a key time to recover that worked with the season schedule because he was just coming back and playing because that's the guy he is. So, I mean, he had that season-ending ankle injury in February, the year before he signed with the Panthers, and that gave him ample time to get ready, get himself healed, get himself healthy, and he came into training camp healthy. And I think that was the overarching key piece for Oliver Ekman-Larsson to kind of look like himself again, was that he had his legs back and he's able to do these things that he was able to do before he was playing through constant pain. And I mean, I've talked with Oliver about this several times, and that's one of the big key pieces to all of this. And also just being in an environment like Florida where it's a winning environment, the locker room is very friendly and accepting as well. So you come into a place where you feel good, you feel good on the ice, you feel good off the ice, and he just had a season where he looked as good as he's been in the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that we now have some of that skating data available on NHL Edge, and it's an awful website to use and try to figure out. But one of the things that we can look is skating bursts over 18 and 20 miles per hour and top speed. And actually looking at his last season in Vancouver, just over 11, 18 mile an hour bursts per 60. And that's basically around average, slightly below average for defensemen. This year, he had over four more per 60 and a top speed over a mile and a half faster, which just goes to show the healthy part. And when you're dealing with lower body injuries and being a defenseman that logs those minutes that he has in the past, he's somebody that had played 20 minutes a game every single season since his rookie season. That ended up changing this season. So how did his role change once Ekblad and Montour came back in the lineup and ultimately kind of decided his place in the lineup over the course of the rest of the season?
Yeah, so once they came back, he slid into the bottom pair with Dmitry Kulikov, and I mean, with Oliver Ekman-Larsson being the guy he is, he did not take that as a role to just step back. He still came into the rink and gave it the same effort he did when he was on the top pair, and that bottom pair was one of the best in the league. I mean, Kulikov's a guy that was really good on the penalty kill. He's there blocking shots, very good in the defensive zone. So I mean, that pairing still allowed Oliver Ekman-Larsson to be the player that he could be in the offensive zone and provide a punch when the third unit's out there. So, I mean, he didn't slow down and he still kept putting up points even after the minutes went down. But he was very mature about that and he kind of knew that was coming when he signed here. But he had his month to showcase that he can play those top pairing minutes again. And then once those two guys came back, he just went, kept doing the same thing, kept giving the team what it needed. Well, whether it was manning the second power play unit, playing on the second pair or the third pair. And when guys went down, he was able to shift back up in the lineup because there were periods of time where Aaron Ekblad was injured or a few other guys were injured, and it called for him to go back up. And when he did go back up, the team didn't miss a beat because this guy is still capable of playing those kinds of minutes. And that's what made the Panthers so good throughout the regular season, no matter who went down, because they have another guy that can step up and be that guy if they need him to. And they have a bunch of depth guys that they added during that offseason as well, who filled those spots when Oliver Ekman-Larsson went up. I mean, this is a time for me to shout out Uvis Balinskis because he was
Nice.
really
Yeah.
good. I know this is an Oliver Ekman-Larsson episode, but I had to shout out Uvis Balinskis.
Hey, he's a good
But
player. Yeah.
he is a good player.
Yeah, love the Latvian content. I hope he gets some more run this season. He's a fun little depth player for sure.
He could get some more run this year, and like Oliver Ekman-Larsson, he's a good skater. He provides some kind of punch in the offensive zone. Didn't put up a lot of points this year, but he made some plays. But yeah, like guys like that step up when Oliver Ekman-Larsson does, and that's really what made the Panthers such a well-oiled machine going into the playoffs. And when you had a guy like Aaron Ekblad go down with an injury that you kind of wanted to have him be rested for the playoffs. He got injured late in the year. Oliver Ekman-Larsson went back up to the top pairing, and again, the Panthers didn't really miss a beat. They were able to win the division. They were able to get a first round matchup with the Lightning, and the rest is history from there. Once you get Aaron Ekblad back in the lineup, and Oliver Ekman-Larsson made some pretty big plays throughout the playoff run there. I know during the Rangers series in overtime, he made a really good defensive play. It doesn't get remembered because Barclay Goodrow scored the overtime winner there, but I mean, he was a very key contributor to that Panthers lineup, and he will be missed down there, and he deserved every cent he got with the Maple Leafs.
Yeah, and so we get into the playoffs now, and he's playing that third pairing role with Dmitry Kulikov. He ends up playing basically 15-30 per playoff game. How did his role kind of change from the regular season there to the playoffs in terms of his usage? And how did that kind of help him as a veteran player who's dealt with injuries before, have the gas to go all the way to the Cup final and be very good in the Cup final as well?
The thing is, I don't really think anyone's, especially on defense, I don't really think anyone's role changed for the playoffs. I mean, this is a team that was playing a playoff style of hockey all year and has been like working through the kinks of it all season to be able to play that style of game. So once you get to the playoffs, there was no changing. He was still that same guy who could go in there and play a few extra minutes if needed or man the power play if needed, like he did in game seven. So yeah, I mean, there was no changing. He was just the same guy making the same plays. He scored at least one big goal there. So, I mean, this is a guy that can basically do it all for you back there. Played some steady two-way play, score a couple goals, make a few good stretch passes, all that good stuff. And it was just a very key contributor back there on that third pairing.
Yeah, and he was fantastic in the Cup final, as I said there. He won his minute 6-1 against the Oilers in that series, had some great tracking data from Corey Schneider as well. Can you take us through kind of his impact on the Cup final and what you thought of his game throughout the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the Cup final, the third line and the third pairing needed to make a difference there because those were the minutes where Connor McDavid wasn't on the ice. And I mean, it was a group effort from all those guys. I mean, Anton Lundell was spectacular during that Cup final. He had 7 assists. His line mates were just as good. And I mean, when that line was on the ice with that defense pairing, the Panthers were hounding them in their own end, especially when they had the change advantage at home, where you're actually able to have all five of those guys on the ice instead of having to mix and match. And you have Lundell out there against McDavid or Draisaitl, which even then, I mean, I'm going slightly off topic here. Lundell was very good against those two lines. But when you had those five guys on the ice, they kind of outshined whoever the Oilers had in their depth department. So, I mean, Oliver Ekman-Larsson was a big part of it, and he was a very good puck mover, and that allowed the Panthers to be so good in possession when they could, especially the first three games before things kind of slid to Edmonton's direction. Once that happened, there wasn't really anyone doing that great during games 4 through 6. But talking games 1 through 3 and game 7, that was one of the Panthers' biggest advantages during the Cup final.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about the power play and how Ekman Larson filled that void at the beginning of the season, played PP2 kind of throughout the rest of the season for the most part. But obviously, one of the big storylines in the Cup final was OEL getting back on that top unit over Brandon Montour. Can you kind of take us through what the perception of that move was at the time and kind of how that ended up playing out with Ekman Larson on the top power play unit?
Yeah, so I mean, during that slide where the Oilers were making their comeback on the Panthers, the power play just took a very severe slide, and there were some very sloppy plays being made to lead to a bunch of Edmonton goals. I mean, the Oilers got their start on their comeback with a couple of early shorthanded goals, and that kind of sunk the Panthers early. So they needed to make a change. They switched things up to get Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Tarasenko on the power play those last couple games. I think Oliver Ekman-Larsson actually made the debut there in Game 6, and Tarasenko went up there in Game 7. But I mean, they still didn't light up the score sheet on the power play. I mean, that's not going to happen when you're playing the Oilers. But that first power play in Game 7 was very important because they did not make any sloppy plays. They just kept going, and eventually, right after it expired, that's when Carter Verhaeghe tipped in the Evan Rodriguez shot, and that's when the Panthers get their 1-0 lead. And from that moment on, they were playing the game on their terms. Even after Edmonton scored their goal, the Panthers were still in their element there, playing a 1-1 game, and that led to Oliver Ekman-Larsson's defense partner actually making the key play of the game there, saving a goal and then sending Sam Reinhart on out on that breakout for the game-winning goal there. So he was on the ice for that. That was a big moment. That was his defense partner doing the work there, but that was quite the moment there.
Yeah,
And
and yeah, you talk about the defense partner there in Kulikov and playing primarily with him down the stretch and in the playoffs earlier in the season with Gus Forsling. How did you see Ekman Larsson's game kind of change playing with those two, if at all?
um, that's a good question, but I mean, I didn't see too much of a change from him. There wasn't too much of a change in mentality, and I mean, he was just committed to playing the style of hockey the Panthers wanted to see from him, and that meant coming up and taking some shots. That meant playing a solid two-way game, back checking pretty hard, and I don't think there was a change in mentality from going from Forsling to Kulikov. Maybe when he was with Kulikov, he needed to be a little bit more defensively conscious because Forsling's good enough to cover for anybody. But other than that, I didn't really see any kind of change in mentality from him during that change. And he's had to flip-flop back and forth a couple of times when guys went down, and he was able to kind of manage that very well, despite when playing with Forsling, he goes to the right side, he goes to the left side with Kulikov. So even flip-flopping sides, I didn't really see any like dramatic change in mentality, change in play style. He kind of just went in there and did what was needed of him. And I mean, that's what you do when you're on a team that's going to win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah, and looking at the Panthers, one of the big narratives around the team is how many careers they've revitalized. Obviously, a bunch of forwards in that mix, but some key defensemen as well. You look at Brandon Montour bouncing around a couple teams before really finding a home with the Panthers the past few seasons. Gustav Forsling, obviously, the huge breakout season in terms of everyone realizing just how great this guy is defensively and through the neutral zone and so many different factors where the prevailing thought coming into the year was he was probably their third or fourth defenseman, and people realized, oh, this is their top guy. And then Ekman-Larsson fits in that group as well, I think, coming from Vancouver, some pretty poor seasons there. Just kind of a very hockey kind of overall was very low on Ekman-Larsson coming into the season, just given the injury issues, how far his game had fallen off the past few seasons. And he finds his game again with the Panthers. What is it about the Panthers that are able to get the most out of all of these players that they find and consistently churn out these top performances from all of these players that they bring in?
Well, they have a really good scouting staff and just finding guys that fit the flavor of hockey that they want to play and guys they think that can come in there and have that kind of mentality, both with how they conduct themselves off the ice and the way they handle things. And I mean, a guy like Gustav Forsling, they saw his tape when he was playing in the AHL and his NHL games, and you see a guy who can skate like the wind, and he's very fit, and he puts a lot of work in the weight room, and you turn that guy into a guy who is one of the best defensive hockey players in the entire NHL because he has the tools to make it done to do it, and he's also just one of these smarter guys out there. So, I mean, they just do a really good job of identifying guys that could make that jump. And with Oliver Ekman-Larsson, I mean, the tape speaks for itself when you look at his early career with Arizona and how things went before the injuries happened. And all of a sudden, you get the guy coming in finally with a healthy offseason. I mean, I think that was just the perfect storm for him to kind of join that group of guys they revitalized. Like another guy like Carter Verhaeghe. When early in his career, he was a grinder with some speed, and I mean the work ethic on this guy. I mean, I wrote a story on him pretty early on with my time covering the Panthers, where I talked to a lot of people who dealt with him early in his career. And I mean, the overarching theme with Verhaeghe was just the work ethic was insane. He skates like the wind, and eventually he was able to get himself to a point where his shot was just ridiculous. But I mean, even watching a guy like Carter Verhaeghe now, he scored 40 goals in a season, and he's still one of the first guys on the ice working on his shot every day. So those are the kinds of guys that the Panthers look for that will ultimately kind of last that war of attrition in the playoffs and win the Stanley Cup.
Take us through your interactions with Ekman-Larsson over the season. Obviously, it was a very exciting season for him to finally be healthy, get back in the playoffs as well after missing for a few years. What was it like interacting with Ekman-Larsson?
Oh, he was a gem to deal with throughout his time here. I mean, I wrote several pretty good stories on him during his time here. Like I know early in the season he had some friends come in with jerseys half Sweden, half Finland or half Panthers, and there's just a bunch of people from his hometown rooting for him. So we had a nice chat about his hometown. He's a very humble guy, cares about his hometown a lot, and he brought the Stanley Cup there uh, just a couple weeks ago. So he didn't forget about him then. But I mean, just talking about where his career was at the time and where things were going with the Panthers. I mean, as I said before, the overarching thing was that he was just very happy to be in a place where he felt healthy. He felt able to go out there and play some consistent minutes every night on a winning team. And he just had the mentality that he was going to do everything he can to be a key piece to that team, be a veteran voice, or be a player who can log 15 or 25 minutes, no matter what it was. Because at times he's had to kind of fall on both sides of the spectrum. So, I mean, this was a guy that was just committed to winning, and he was very humble and was very appreciative of the opportunity. And he was very happy to be on a winning team because he hasn't had that much in his career. So, I mean, this was just a guy who he's the kind of the kind of guy the Florida Panthers look for. I mean, he just came to the rink with a happy face whenever he could, and he kind of went in there and did his job no matter what it was.
Yeah, and just finally here, what was the reaction to Ekman-Larsson's contract in Florida? He gets 4 years, which I think a lot of people weren't necessarily expecting that much term, but the cap hit at 3.5 million, a million and a quarter raise from what he was making last year with the Panthers. What was the reaction in Florida to that contract, and ultimately, what were the moves made by the Panthers to help kind of fill that void now?
Yeah, so I mean, everybody's happy for him here, obviously. I mean, he came in here, did his job, did it really well. So for him to get that kind of money and that kind of term on a contract, I think he did really well for himself. And he earned that as a Stanley Cup champion. I mean, you had a lot of guys leave and a lot of guys get paid, and he's one of the most deserving, along with Anthony Stolars, who I'm sure you're going to want to talk about later. But he's another good story too. But yeah, I mean he earned that money, and he's going to be a good player for the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time, Colby. Let the people know where we can find your work and plug anything else as well.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Colby Guy. I am currently freelancing for the Associated Press and the Palm Beach Post. I'm still looking for a permanent home for everything else, so um, I don't have an answer for that yet. But when I do have an announcement to make, you can find it on Twitter at Colby Guy.
Yeah, be sure to check out Colby's work for anything Panthers related. One of the best in the business and one of the best beat reporters on throughout the entire league. His work with the Panthers was fantastic throughout the entire season, but especially the playoffs as well. So be sure to check out his work. And if you're anybody that is hiring, be sure to reach out to him because he does some great work. Colby, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Colby for jumping on the show. That's going to do it for today's edition of Camp Countdown. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more Leafs Camp Countdown. We'll see you then.